Hello, welcome back to another EA Zoom meeting. I'm Bradley Naragon. Today, talking about Neptune and Sagittarius. Neptune. Neptune and Sagittarius. You know, like anyone else, I was born and grew up amongst my peers in my generation. And for the most part, I couldn't really relate to what a lot of them believed and how they understood reality that then led into their judgments. And I say this because Neptune correlates to, Sagittarius correlates to what we believe, what we know, our paradigm, you know. So, and one of the things that Sagittarius correlates in evolutionary astrology is with natural law. And some people with Neptune and Sagittarius have this as an ideal in their consciousness, but some do not. But it could be argued that they do, but we're going to get into that a little bit more here as we proceed. Yesterday, I was in the store and somebody came up to me and said, "Tell me about Neptune in 2 sentences." And I said, actually kind of liked that question, actually. It was pretty exciting. And I said, well, Neptune in evolutionary astrology correlates to consciousness and the phenomena of consciousness within the individual. Then it correlates to what holds ultimate meaning in the individual consciousness. And of course, Neptune correlates to the phenomena of connectedness and oneness of all that is. Maybe that was a lot more than 2 sentences, but that's all I had. And they went on their way. So it's important to understand when we talk about Neptune in any sign that Neptune correlates with consciousness itself and ideals in consciousness. So when we think about, actually I'm going to stay on this slide. When we think about Neptune and Sagittarius, Neptune also correlates with imagination, right? Neptune correlates with the collective consciousness. And so in the collective consciousness, we have any possible idea, anything that could exist, past, present, future, where, you know, time doesn't really exist. And from that place, right, is invisible. But yet everything that we see that then at some point in time and place manifests comes from this invisible, the Neptune. And Sagittarius is a visionary sign, as we know. So if you combine these things, you have this imagination of Neptune with the vision that Sagittarius can have. So, the potential for imagining and seeing possibilities and visions is great. And we're going to get into some examples about how that plays out for individuals. A while back, someone told me that Sagittarius correlated with cinema and film, and I really didn't understand it, to be honest with you. It was kind of confusing at the time why it did. And I think that's like, I don't know if you're like me, but a lot of the, generic or stereotypical correlations to signs and houses, you hear them and you're like, well, why does the 8th house correlate to taxes? And what does taxes and death, sex, and birth have to do with each other? And why they're in the same house, it doesn't make any sense. That's why I love evolutionary astrology, because it gives us a chance to get down to the root, the core of the archetype, and then you can see how everything is then connected to it. And so Sagittarius, of course, is the storyteller, it's the visionary, sees the big picture, right? And so Sagittarius, right, is that part of the mind that we can see like a whole plot, whole concept. It can expand and grow, especially with Neptune, right? This expansive imagination of the story and the plot and what a vision could be communicated as. So in that sense, it totally makes sense that it correlates with cinema, but I didn't get that for a long time. And of course, the polarity Gemini, and then of course Virgo, in relation to that, you have this story that you're going to communicate to the world in some fashion, and then you have like all that details, and you have to put it into words, you have to put it into screen, you have to go through all that work. That's the Gemini Virgo side of it, right? But neither one can happen without the other, and so they're really interconnected in that way. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Gemini connection with Sagittarius as everything evolves through polarity, evolutionary astrology. That's one of our basic principles. So when we look at Neptune in a chart, we're talking about what in the consciousness holds ultimate meaning. And then you put that in Sagittarius, and so we're talking about a person, and then we're asking the question, what beliefs, what truth, what meaning, what understanding of life in their consciousness holds ultimate meaning, and why? So I might skip this. Hold on a second. I'll return to this, but I want to say is I'm going to talk about evolutionary stages a little bit today, because to me, none of this astrology makes any sense when you consider how it expresses in different individuals if you don't consider the evolutionary stages. And so I live in the United States, and in the mainstream modern US culture, I mean, in a way, selfishness is kind of modeled as the path, because who's going to actually look out for you but yourself? So you got to take care of yourself first. And a lot of people model, a very loving, supportive, non-selfish ways, and have great ethics and morals. And so, it's a diversity of things, but, when it comes down to it, the world can be really harsh, and it really feels like, who's going to look out for me? Who's going to take care of me? I've got to advocate for myself. And so I say this because I'm talking about the consensus culture. And so when you talk about the mainstream culture and the consensus culture, what does the mainstream culture's beliefs and religion connect to, right? How are we taught to interpret life through the culture we're born in? And that's a really significant part of interpreting Neptune and Sagittarius. I would say that for people that have Neptune and Sagittarius, you could say that, life is a journey, not a destination. Sagittarius correlates with learning or expansion of consciousness, right? To have one's sails filled with the inspiration that life makes sense and has some meaning is a very important part of Neptune and Sagittarius. So immediately that brings up the scenario of, like, what if life doesn't have meaning? And we're going to talk a little bit about the disillusionment aspect and the D's, all the D's of Neptune and Pisces, and how that plays out with Sagittarius. So again, to me, as an astrologer, one of the great things that we can do is not assume that we know, and that's one of the things I love about evolutionary astrology. Jeffrey Wolf Green is always saying it's based on observation and correlation. So I have that kind of drilled into my head, and if I don't know, I don't know, but I know that I can ask a question. And with Neptune, again, we start with this question: what holds ultimate meaning in the consciousness? And what does one believe, and what does one know, right? We'll talk more about the difference between belief in knowledge also in a little bit. So someone used the phrase with me the other day, and I never heard this before. It's probably like a common phrase, the sheeple. It's like people, sheep, all doing the same thing. And of course, in my head, I was thinking about, a certain percentage of the population is in more of a consensus evolutionary state. Therefore, they're evolving through the norms of culture that they're born into. And and what I want to talk about that in a little bit is how there's really no judgment about that, and that there's examples of really positive and also negative um, within any evolutionary stage, um, and why in this culture we have this concept of sheeple and kind of like a disgust for the mainstream culture, and how that affects how we think about consensus. Um, let's see. Oh yeah, going to talk about evolutionary stages a little bit here. Um, so to me, like I was saying, it's like we have to know, if we're going to know, um, the way in which somebody interprets the phenomenal reality, uh, the way someone interprets the meaning of all the experiences within their consciousness, within their psyche. Um, we have to keep in mind what their evolutionary stage is, uh, and this is where, in evolutionary astrology, there's this idea that the consciousness is aware of more, is greater, expansive, and I really want to make the point that more expansive is not necessarily better, and so, um, and my point is that to like just like keep in mind that anybody can really um, deviate from following natural laws, the laws that are written in their heart, and living in integrity in a moment, in a larger period of their life, for a lifetime or more. And so we have these examples of people who are, spiritual and very evolved, and it's like this ideal that we're trying to get to, and that's great that we want to be better people and evolve. That's great, of course. I'm not pooing on that, but what I'm saying is just that there's some people who are more conscious and have more capacities and abilities, and they can be jerks too, you know. Um, so um, in evolutionary astrology, Capricorn is a sign after Sagittarius, and how we interpret and what we know then leads into judgments, and that's just a natural phenomena, right? And so if we have individuals who are rejecting the mainstream culture that we see in the world today, because we can see all the dis-ease, the disease in the culture all over the place, um, and that people know that there's an emptiness therein, right? So then it doesn't make sense in a certain way from that person's consciousness to have some frame of reference of like, what the hell is this, and why are you going along with this? But if you have the context of evolutionary stage, you have a little more context for it. And Neptune, it's obviously it's about this idea that we're all connected in some way, shape, form, level. We actually are all connected. We can't really mostly handle in our consciousness what that would be. So we have these filters, right? But it doesn't mean that we're not still affected by the experiences within life and humanity and the web of life on planet Earth. Um, and here's my little thing to prove this point. It's kind of depressing, actually. But in the United States, more people die from suicide than from murder, and we have the mainstream media putting this image of what's going on in the country with violence, and suicide rates are rising greatly, right? They, according to Wikipedia, they went up 24% from 1999 to 2014. Here's a little graph from the Wiki suicide site. So we can see suicides in the U.S. are on a rise as a whole, and if you look on this one, you can see that white non-Hispanic is the highest suicide rate, right? And this one you can see that male obviously is way higher than female, and so it's interesting because basically it's saying like that you know, in the United States, the most privileged position to be born into, an able-bodied white male, has the highest suicide rate. So clearly, the success and the achievement of what the culture has given us as success has this inner emptiness, and that because people are suffering in our country all over, and you know, you can drive home and have your perfect house and perfect everything, like you can't disconnect from it. You can have it as out of sight, not as mind, but like to me, like it proves that somewhere in the consciousness and the psyche we're connected, and look, I mean, you know, like what, why else would this be? So you know, a horrible thing for Neptune and Sagittarius would be like a loss of total meaning, right? Sagittarius is the meaning that we interpret for life. So Neptune, if we're confused about it, or if we lose that meaning, that can be really challenging, because the ideal is to have this understanding of life and this meaning of life. And we're going to talk about a little bit of that, because this generation with Neptune transiting in Pisces, having our Neptune square, my friend said, talk about Neptune square Neptune, so we'll talk about that. So we're here today, and I really want to emphasize that there's a diverse potential expressions for Neptune and Sagittarius. You know, there's so many ways that archetypes can be expressed, and part of what I'm trying to convey is how to see how they're connected and all part of this archetype, right? So we can identify it at its core. So in the world right now, pretty much everyone that has Neptune and Sagittarius has Pluto and Libra, right? It's basically the Pluto and Libra generation for the most part. We have a lot of Libran themes woven into the generation that we know that has Neptune and Sagittarius. So I have a few examples today. I just went back to the previous Neptune and Sag generation, some folks born in the early 1800s. So we'll look at them with some chart examples also. And the first one, it's just a really short example, but this one to me highlights that, again, Neptune is an ideal in Sagittarius learning. So we can see that some people who have Neptune and Sagittarius highlighted will really emphasize how important it is for education and learning, right? This woman was born in December 13th, 1815. Paulny Verez. I admit I'm horrible with any other language pronunciation, so Paulny Verez is my best pronunciation there. A Hungarian teacher and feminist, and of course I don't have her exact birth time, but here's a chart, and we can see in her chart that she's got a lot of Sagittarius. She was she was a strong promoter of women's rights, and she opened the first secondary school for women in Hungary. Pretty amazing. She also founded the Hungarian National Association for Women's Education. The other thing that is interesting, well, in her chart, she has also Uranus is right there. Obviously, Neptune's in a close conjunction with the sun, and then Uranus and Mercury are right there. So, you know, she must have been a bit of a mover and shaker in her time, clearly, to be doing this and paving the way. A lot of people with Neptune and Sagittarius will have it in close proximity to the south node of Uranus, which is also in Sagittarius. And a couple of the examples today will also have the south node of Mars in Sagittarius. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I will say now that, you know, when you have Neptune in Sagittarius to begin with, and then it's near Uranus or the south node of Uranus, there's this ideal, right, of that is strongly connected to liberation and freedom, and there's a really good example of that coming up. And when my kids were in elementary school, I loved it because they did this theme called Movers and Shakers, and I always thought that was a nice phrase for the Uranian spirit, basically like revolutionaries, right? And then once you have that Mars, Uranus, like freedom fighters. Let's see what we have next. Oh yeah. So yeah, she actually has south node of Mars in Sag, south node of Mercury, and south node of Uranus all in Sag. And so, you know, if we look at it and think about somebody who really is more in line with natural laws, you know, by our birthright, we should all have certain freedoms and liberties, right? And that's kind of what this chart speaks to me in a way. And obviously, she expressed that in her life. Also, talking about a Pluto in Pisces generation. So the Pluto is then ruled by the Neptune and Sag. So that's an interesting spin on it. And a lot of these charts have strong Pluto or strong Pisces in them today. So one of the things I think about with Neptune and Sagittarius is I just call like pure archetypal understanding. And I don't know if I'll have time. I'll see if I have time at the end, but I have this little piece about like how the planetary south nodes and how other generational and elements and planets have kind of like created different like hues, and they're woven into how archetypes express. And so there's this thing about really understanding the pure essence of an archetype and how some of us can have that slightly tied to other archetypes, whether we know it or not. It's an interesting idea, but I don't want to get too far off the topic. I kind of rewrote my own definition for the word archetype. Original mold, model, symbol, a motive, pattern, concept, or theme which reoccurs. So when I think of Neptune and Sagittarius and how Sagittarius correlates with concepts, conceptual learning, right brain stuff, right? I had this question come up, basically like, which archetypes hold the most meaning in consciousness? Which archetypes resonate in an individual psyche? What stories, right? Because the stories and the characters in them have archetypes. It's a question to consider. So like I was saying, someone with Neptune and Sagittarius could certainly idealize natural laws. From the School of Evolutionary Astrology message board, this is a quote from Rad. He wrote, Sagittarius correlates with the totality of all the natural laws set in motion by the Creator relative to the act of creation itself. So we can first start and ask what laws govern and define personal cosmology, religion, paradigm, or belief, and what archetypes are most prominent and most resonant in the psyche, what are most meaningful in the consciousness, and why. Um, and to really answer that question, this is where we have to be detectives as evolutionary astrologers, and we have to know what the evolutionary stage of the soul is. We need to understand all the environmental conditions that one was born into in this life, the cultural norms and the mainstream culture at the time and the place of the birth, and within that life, subcultures and dynamics. And so there's a lot of learning, that a lot of cultural and social learning that happens with evolutionary astrology. But if you understand all that, and then you get into an individual's personal story, then you can really reveal why these specific archetypes and stories resonate. And of course, we have where they're coming from, where what were their past lives, right? Belief versus knowing. This concept is definitely very Sagittarian. And with Neptune and Sagittarius, obviously we could convince ourselves that we know something, that we believe, but we're delusional. There's a lot of possibilities. But obviously Sagittarius, Jupiter, and the ninth house, they all correlate with learning and education and the expansion of consciousness. Sagittarius correlates with beliefs and faith. And it also correlates with knowing. And this is a really, it's a point that is definitely talked about in evolutionary astrology, that, like belief is what you have before you have knowing, basically, and knowing comes with personal experience. So it's that simple. And then as far as knowing goes, I've kind of used, I use the word gnosis here as I'll explain it, empirical knowledge versus gnosis. So one of the things I love about evolutionary astrology and a lot of spiritual teachings and just people who are teaching empowerment say that we have access to knowledge and learning from within ourselves. And in evolutionary astrology, second house Taurus, the internalization of consciousness, is a connection to Neptune, Pisces, 12th house, right? Plug into this access to all knowledge. And obviously we've seen on the planet that we've had this patriarchal societies for thousands of years, have made an effort to shift knowing to believing. That's how I'm saying it or seeing it now, and that the man-made religions have scrupulously worked to remove the individual from an empowered path to knowledge, right, and put it in the hands of a select few. And then we have this phenomenon in the modern Western culture that has further emphasized real knowledge that's empirical, that we can prove it scientifically, that we can see and observe it. And then we have this phenomenon with capitalistic society and economy, that greed within that model controls access to learning, knowledge, and power, and puts a price tag on it. And so, but ultimately, empirical knowledge is based on the phenomenal universe. It's a path of learning and knowing that's entirely based on the external world. And so, it's like our public schools very much emphasize this, but they don't emphasize all these other forms of intelligence and learning. But it's starting to change a little bit, definitely needs a huge overhaul. And so in what we call Gnosticism today, I don't know what they actually call themselves necessarily, well, I know a few different names, but anyway, there's this idea that gnosis is basically the knowledge that we can access, and that we can all access it from within ourselves. And that's one of the things I love about the Gnostic Bible and those teachings that got kind of chopped and cut out, is that they do teach that. And it's in line with the evolutionary astrology teachings. It's just that we can source knowledge from within. But that would be different than empirical knowledge. We gain knowledge from within, and how do you define that or measure that for someone in a lab? So let me just do a time check here. Okay, yikes. Keep going here. Right, so Neptune and Sagittarius, it can mean that just simply that someone idealizes the teachings, the truth, the paradigm that they're into, right? It can be that simple. And we definitely see that. And so with the Pluto and Libra generation that we have right now, and how that Pluto's, in a sextile to that Neptune and Sagittarius, sextile provides this opportunity for learning through social spheres, through relationships. So I would say for the current generation that there's this really connection to a diversity of paths, cosmologies, ways of learning, and feeding off of a lot of the opportunity of the modern global culture and reality that we're now living in. So yeah, at the most fundamental level of understanding what is knowledge, and so yeah, like I said, there's this expanding consciousness, gnosis, knowledge, and then there's the phenomenal knowledge. So just making a point that there's these two different types of knowledge that somebody could be talking about. So it's good to make sure that you're on the same page. I think about covered that. Okay. But yeah, the Neptune and Sagittarius also, of course, correlates to disillusionment with religion. And that's going to be a really common theme for pretty much like, individuating and probably like also spiritually evolved souls in the modern culture, if they're grown up indoctrinated in some religion, because of certain truths within the teachings, there can be this connection of meaning and resonance, and then seeing the truth and the reality and what it honestly is as one grows and matures. There's a disillusionment phenomena that happens with religion. And so that's a whole interesting phenomenon, because like what happens in the consciousness if someone grows up and then they reject religion, and yet they have Neptune and Sagittarius, so they're looking to have some meaning and inspiration that makes sense of life for them, and the predominant model has failed to do that. So then where does someone turn to, and what do they fill that with? It's another question to ask. And another thing that I really like about evolutionary astrology is that it is like everyone has their own natural way of learning. We all have our own path. It doesn't really make sense to look at someone else and say, like they're doing better or further, or, it's like we're all on our path, and life itself, it just teaches us. And so if we don't make any effort, of course, the process of learning is slower. And it seems that that's like what a lot of true gurus are here to do, is basically like, well, we could speed up your evolution if you want to make the effort. Otherwise, it'll be more painful and take longer. But eventually, you'll get there. So yeah, if we have a spiritual void and there's this massive disillusionment, and someone's in this place where they're saying God's not real, and then people just want to believe what they want to believe. It's a story, it's a fantasy, you made this whole thing up. someone could really go there, right? And that would also correlate to Neptune and Sagittarius. I don't know if you ever do this, but kind of like realize how many D words correlate with Pisces and Neptune. I probably could do more than the list I have, but obviously like divine, deception, delusion, denial, disappear, disassociate, Dionysus, drunk, dependence, dive, like off the abyss, right? Dream. So the Ds of Neptune and Sag, relative to what someone believes and knows, they could be spinning out, or in a cloud of any of the Ds, really. And Sagittarius, of course, is a lot of fun, and that's the reason there's still parties. Otherwise, we'd be really depressed. Sagittarius does bring humor and levity. So with Neptune and Sag, that could be a thing, right? That there's this idealization of humor and comedy, of levity, of optimism. That's it could be drunken humor, Neptune and Sag, divine comedy, right? Different ways to look at that. So these questions we ask. And especially, this is a great question to ask if you know anyone having Neptune square Neptune. What do you believe and what holds meaning? And maybe we wouldn't ask it that directly, maybe we would. And how do we form meaning? So I was thinking about Neptune square Neptune, and first quarter square is, of course, the classic like crisis in action. And then the last quarter square is crisis in consciousness. Well, Neptune correlates to consciousness. So then I was like, well, that's weird. How do you do that? So I was sitting with this and asking, like, what does your Neptune square mean? And I went back to my old Planets in Transit book and read what Rob Hand had to say about it. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And essentially, what I see this Neptune square as, and of course it's timing with the Uranus opposition, but it might hit before or after, but it's around there. So it's themed with the midlife crisis, for one, right, for everybody. So there's this layer to the midlife crisis of a crisis in action, the actions that you've taken in your life to make it meaningful for you, right? Because something holds meaning in your consciousness. And in Neptune and Sagittarius generation, we have a belief about ourselves. We have a vision for who we would become eventually in life, right? So we have hopes and dreams. And when you reach this Neptune square from Pisces, there's a great opportunity for taking away the illusion, the disillusionment of what we hoped, the dream that we had, and how it may or may not be happening, and how our own actions have basically like led to the crisis of meaning in our life. So there's definitely like this in that tension. There's a really great chance to make some decisions to bring more meaning into life, but because we're talking about Neptune, and Neptune's in Pisces, there's also a chance to totally delude oneself and project more fantasies onto reality, and just kind of go off the deep end. It's a good time to really sit with these questions and say, what's most meaningful for me in life? What do I really want to do and work towards? And what am I really excited about and passionate about? That's what I'm here to do, right? It might not be the best time to really make huge decisions, because it could, if you have to be really conscious of all the layers that's going on, or maybe like wait for the fog to clear a little bit and then be like, yeah, this is it. So crisis in meaning. An example of that, which I don't know a lot about is one of my favorite hip hop artists, Tumex Alejandro Ocana. And at his Neptune square, well, here's his chart. I don't have a birth time, unfortunately, but I, I do kind of think this chart makes a lot of sense in some ways. There's Neptune in Sag, and of course, there's a lot of Pisces here. That's all ruled by that Neptune. And so this day here is a day that Tumex was rushed to the hospital for complications with diabetes that led to, basically, he almost died, but he didn't die, but he had to get half of one of his legs removed. And so you can see that not only is, so obviously the Neptune square is there, but it's not, it's kind of, he's at the end of his Neptune square, but what you'll notice is you've got an activation over there with Jupiter in Virgo, and then down here, Saturn's in Sagittarius, also activating the square, and then Mars, which is often, Mars and Sun are often triggers for if you have a bigger transiting pattern, you know, coming to life, and then Mars and the Sun hit, it's just like, it just goes down. There's Mars, you know, conjunct that Neptune. So, and then of course the nodes are right there too, in Virgo, Pisces. And from what I can see from the little bit that I've gleaned, I would definitely say that there was a crisis in consciousness, and there was a different quality to what, like his approach to life and his energy after he came out, came back from that and hit the stage again. Some really powerful stuff. It did an album called Lospital, which kind of really went into the whole experience of what anybody goes through who suffers a great thing and has to go through the medical. It's actually not the end. Sorry. It could be. So yeah, we're all connected, obviously. And I've been kind of struggling in my life with understanding Mercury and Gemini archetype in a way that's not kind of like boring, connected to these stereotypes about Gemini, because I love Gemini and Mercury as an archetype, and I find it more and more fascinating through time. And for some reason, you know, there's just like the connotations, the stereotypes of the archetype that simplify it a certain bit. So one of the things I was thinking about is how, like in the tarot, the Magician card, like, you know, that correlates with Mercury, Hermes, and, you know, the as above, so below. So basically, like, I'm going to read a quote from Jeffrey Wolf Green, and then I'm going to follow that thought. He says, this is from the Uranus book. Jupiter intuits and makes consciously available to the individual the projected creation of Uranus. The intuitions of Jupiter translate into abstract or conceptual thought involving principles. Mercury is plugged into Uranus by way of Jupiter. Mercury translates into linear or applied thought that is specific and relative to the nature of each individual. Thus, Uranus projects through Jupiter to the existing channels of Mercury in order to make new connections, thoughts. And so basically we have this thing of like, you know, like you've probably heard Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury, you know, and so it's through Jupiter, through the intuition, that we connect with this Uranus, this higher mind. You know, like we get, some people say they get intuitive downloads, right? Like this higher mind, but really, like, what if we flipped it? Because, you know, higher mind, lower mind, essentially what we're talking about is this, right? We've got this connection between Mercury, Jupiter, and Uranus, and transmission of, and of course, Uranus in evolutionary astrology correlates to the entire subconscious, the individual subconscious, and the whole blueprint for the soul. So coming through Jupiter, you can get some like serious flashes of knowing, or not, you know, not like an empirical knowing where in a science lab, someone can prove how you knew that, but you're right, we get transmissions of sorts. Also, they could be delusions, dreams. So if we flip it, right, then I was thinking, like, well, what is this? This kind of reminds me of the iceberg analogy, right? We flip it, because in the iceberg, the Uranus represents the whole subconscious realm. And so Mercury is the conscious mind up here in the pyramid. And in my last, I think it was maybe my last talk on Chiron, I was talking about how Chiron crosses this Saturnian boundary between the conscious and the unconscious. And then I was like, well, kind of according to this teaching in evolutionary astrology, Jupiter is this plug-in that connects Mercury to Uranus also. And I thought it was kind of funny because they're both centaurs, right? So they're like, well, I guess the centaurs kind of like can cross this border, but Mercury does too, really, because Mercury doesn't really have necessarily a home, god of the road. And so there's this idea that like life itself, like if, okay, well, when I was in, what was it called? Deep memory process. I did a thing with that Patricia with that. And one of the things I loved, she would always say, body knows, right? And so there's this teaching that the actual, like the cells in our body have memories and knowledge that our Mercury mind actually isn't really aware of right now and processing. So the idea of Mercury as the magician and connecting, it's like a conduit between realms, touching between realms. Anytime we touch realms, if we could actually access the intelligence and become aware of it and the knowledge of what we connect with in the physical world, in another body, in our own body, right? We're getting, so it's this idea that whether we're pulling it in through the senses and it's coming in mercurial that way, or it's coming from the subconscious through the intuitive mind, it's just kind of like we're surrounded by this awareness is moving, and Mercury's the conduit for these things. So if that makes sense. So I kind of, with the pyramid, probably more accurately something like this. The subconscious is, like 90%, so Uranus is probably bigger. And then I just, for fun, I threw Pluto and Mars on there, and there's a moon. I should probably add Venus and the sun, but I didn't get that far. And then, yeah, there's Neptune. It's all over the place, right? See how I'm doing on time here. Yikes. This woman is amazing. Let's see. Tawakal Carmen. I don't know if I got that name right, but I don't know if anyone's heard of her. I hadn't until I looked up. I was searching for people with Neptune and Sag, and she's from Yemen. She's a Yemeni human rights activist, journalist, politician, and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And she's had a pretty awesome life. She's actually, she's called Mother of the Revolution in Yemen. And so, and she's also called Iron Woman. She does have south node of Mars and Sag and south node of Uranus and Sag. And then she's got that Mars, Mercury, and Aquarius. There's that Neptune in Sag. South node in Pisces, and then Neptune squares that. There's obviously, we could go into a lot of it. Mother of the Revolution, she's got Ceres in Aquarius, along with that huge stellium. So that's, I mean, pretty fitting. So this day is October 10th, 2005, and I'm highlighting a transit of Neptune's transiting obviously Neptune's huge in her chart. It's the ruler of her south node. It's in Sag. And so we're talking about, and it's conjunct her Mars and Mercury. And so she's doing something that's really inspired her, that has most meaning in life. And of course, in a very Aquarian also way, 2005 with 7 other women, she co-founded Women Journalists Without Chains. And that group's been pretty key in, they call it the Arab Spring and a lot of the movement in Yemen. And the group's goal is promoting human rights, particularly freedom of opinion and expression and democratic rights. So she was one of the people that really brought that forward. 2007, she led some protests and some sit-ins for press freedom. So Mercury having Neptune having left that Mercury, but still close by, is now conjunct the Sun, and obviously there's a Sun-Mercury conjunction in Aquarius, and she's leading these things for press freedom. But I think that the point I want to make too is having Neptune in Sagittarius. She's coming from this place where she knows in her heart that by birthright there should be freedom of speech, freedom of information, and a chance for everybody to learn. And so she's living that, and this is how she's acting that out. And especially like having that south node of Uranus at 17 Sag, really close to all this. I think there's another element there of really believing in being a revolutionary, and the change to return to natural law. This is a quote that she said in 2010. Women should stop being or feeling that they are part of the problem and become part of the solution. We have been marginalized for a long time, and now is the time for women to stand up and become active without needing to ask for permission or acceptance. This is the only way we will give back to our society and allow for Yemen to reach the great potentials it has. And this chart here, Uranus was also transited her south node, so she was in full revolutionary mode. She won the Nobel Peace Prize December 10th, 2011. And then there, like, look at that Sun conjunct that Neptune. North node's right over there. There's a Vesta return and Neptune in late Aquarius. Actually, I think I have time for something else. Couple minutes. Okay. So like I've been saying, natural law could hold ultimate meaning in consciousness. Talking about the paradigm dream. And that is, have you guessed it already? The dream that brought evolutionary astrology, the famous dream. Jeffrey Wolf Green had more of like a transmission from Sri Yukteswar in Sanskrit, in the astral plane while he's sleeping in a dream. This is what he's told us. And so we don't have we don't have a day. I asked on the message board, I was trying to get a date, of course. And sometime in winter of 77 was all we had. But we know in winter of 77, that means Neptune was in Sagittarius at the birth of evolutionary astrology paradigm coming through the transmission. And that's also Neptune and Sag is conjunct the south nodes of Uranus. Of course, Uranus has to do with astrology, and so we have this astrology come forward that's very much aligned with natural laws. It's part of the teaching. It's part of the ideals within the teaching. So it's pretty interesting, I think. Obviously, learning through story can be a huge theme with Neptune and Sagittarius. Associative learning, storytelling, and so we have a lot of amazing storytellers with Neptune and Sagittarius. And really quick, going to cruise through at the end here. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here's her natal chart. Again, time we don't know, but there's that Neptune in Sag. She's got Mercury and Gemini opposite. She's got Saturn in Sag, and then that Sun Jupiter opposite. And yeah, there we go. Pluto conjunct the South Node in Pisces, which is ruled by that Neptune. And so on the March 5th, I picked this as like a few days before she actually kind of publicly announced and wrote that she was going to write the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And another thing I thought about with this whole Neptune and Sag is like, a lot of these people have, through story and through their lives, how they've lived, they've created archetypes for us. And they've also kind of like became archetypes in the culture itself in different ways. So that's an interesting thing to look at. Just do my quick time checks and see how I'm doing. Chiron there was on her Neptune. Neptune's was having a square Neptune actually. And she, according to Harriet, she had the inspiration for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin because she had a vision of a dying slave. And she also had, in the near time, she also lost an 18-month-old son. So we can see a lot of that Pisces unconditional love coming through. Here's a little quote from Harriet, March 9th, 1850. She wrote, "I feel now that the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. I hope every woman who can write will not be silent." So I'm kind of speeding through this because I wanted to get to the last one. There's this famous, she goes to Abraham Lincoln, and her book has been this huge influence in building up to the Civil War and rallying calls for freedom and end of slavery. And supposedly Abraham Lincoln meets and says, so you were the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. Don't know if it's totally true, and obviously there's a big height difference there. Charles Dickens actually is another great example of a storyteller with Neptune and Sag, and look at that, holy moly. So obviously he wrote The Christmas Carol, Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist. He's an English writer and a social critic, and so and I think, to me, Dickens is one of these people that the transit chart I have is, this is the publishing of A Christmas Carol, and I picked it because it's almost Christmas now. Just like I said, he like created an archetype with Ebenezer Scrooge, like in the collective consciousness today, like we kind of all know this archetype. And of course it's a Capricorn, it's an aspect of the Capricorn archetype. And like, why is that character, how did it like permeate the collective consciousness through the story, but like, that's like something that happened with this phenomenon. And also, like, I mean, look at Mercury's on his Saturn and Saturn's on his Mercury when he published Christmas Carol, and so it's really interesting with the whole Capricorn archetype, and obviously like the transformation of this hardened Scrooge, who's he goes to his Cancer polarity basically, and like softens and becomes a more emotional, caring person. It's a real beautiful tale, and just to conclude, I'd say that like, I think one of the reasons that tale resonates within us so much is that we can see within ourselves, how we play out these things and how that impacts us and how we like harden in ways, but we really actually want to to see that moment where we're coming from a place of caring and love, and people are taking care of each other. And that's really the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bradley. Would you like to take a few questions? Because you're the last meeting, so we don't.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm gonna unshare my screen here.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, if anyone has a question or comments, that's wonderful.
Well, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and unmute.
Hi. Hi, Bradley.
Hi.
It's really more of a comment, but I really love how you blended the archetype, the pure archetype. I can definitely see that. I'm a Neptune Sag too, with Moon conjunct, and definitely resonate with that. And I loved your presentation, so thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I also am Neptune Sag, Pluto Libra, but I was wondering what orb you used for the square, Neptune square.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, for me, I mean, that's such an interesting question. I feel like as soon as they're in the squaring signs, there's the energies in effect. But I would say that the real events are like I would use a 5-degree orb, and of course I would start looking at the really close orbs for like the specific really like. But in a broader theme, I think there is this larger overlay that if you expand it to like a 5-degree orb and you take a 3 or 4 year chunk of life, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Bradley.
Hello.
I've been counseling a lot of people with Neptune in Sag. They have Neptune as a skip step in 1978, squaring the Virgo Pisces.
Oh yeah.
Have you noticed that? Do you know those, or is that your? Do you know that?
I don't have that, but I know a lot of people with that. Yeah.
What do you think of that skip step?
So the North Node's in Virgo, and it's usually conjunct Saturn. Is this the chart?
Yeah. And then Neptune is there, and Mars went through there for a while. And then, a lot of them, I get the Sag ones who have the ascendant, the sun, the Mercury. I had one today. Oh, that's so interesting that you're talking about this, because I find it interesting to counsel them.
I mean,
1978.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the real key to that is finding the house that the South Node is in, and looking at like what's unresolved. Like what's this house, and why does it hold great meaning in the person's life? What does that correlate to, and what's not resolved with that? And the obviously, because the resolution is the Virgo node, right? Is that right? Yeah. So
Yes, because Pluto was last over Virgo because it's in Libra.
So it's kind of like that. Like how do you like, right? How do you do the work of the mundane, of the daily? How do you be of service, but like bring in those ideals that you have, whatever that relates to in the rest of the chart? I mean, that's kind of where I start with it, but yeah, I can express a lot of different ways. I mean, of course I have questions immediately. It's interesting. I mean, it just makes me curious to see like to what extent people have that and have a disillusionment, or if they're having more of a resolution theme with it.
Well, because I'm in La La Land, a lot of them are in yoga. My particular set of crew this time, these people are in Kundalini yoga, and they're really working on themselves spiritually. And so it's very interesting to see their Neptune in Sag as a skip step. It's fascinating to me.
That, I mean, just like the idea of taking that the spiritual ideal and then integrating it into the work, the technique, and the practice, right? That's the Virgo integration. So yeah, that sounds like the way to go.
Do you think though that like they got their spiritual, you know, I know Jeffrey's talked a lot about this, and I always find it very interesting because these people are in the spiritual stages, you know, in one or two. Most of them, of course, are in one, but my sense is that they've come back here to just get a better grip because we really didn't have much of a way to address spirituality unless you were maybe a Native American or something, or maybe well, the rest of it was probably all a lot of crap. If you are not an indigenous person. So maybe the Neptune in Sag is coming back to study natural law. That's kind of what I've concluded. I don't know if you have congruence with that.
It makes sense. I mean, it just feels like the Pisces South Node is this piece of disillusionment and a disconnect in a certain lifetime from source or spirituality. So it seems like the natural law and the excess of knowledge today is also helpful to resolve and reconnect.
Thanks. Yeah, that's what I found too.
Thank you.
I actually know someone who has that signature with the Neptune in Sag, you know, square the nodes, and Pluto in Libra. It's a very close, very, very close friend of mine. And it seems like, and watching him in the almost 10 years that I've known him, it's really been a wake-up call as far as the fantasy of, you know, that we put on relationships, from what I'm observing of him and those, you know, that are in his same age group. Maybe too, because my Uranus Pluto sits right on top of these, you know, that 78, 79 bunch, sits right on their North Node. So, so that's, you know, been my observation, you know, with that particular generation.
Yeah, I mean, it's about Pluto Libras, right? So that makes sense too. Yeah. Thanks.
I wanted to mention also the Neptune square Neptune is definitely another, you know, I think, especially having been through it, you know, already, is very much it's a wake-up call, especially if you have been living in La La Land, you know, up to as far as your truth, and, you know, fulfilling your intent, your piece of the puzzle, your role, you know, in the connection of the whole. And if you're not doing that, you know, especially, like I say, in conjunction with the Pluto, square Pluto, because those folks are getting that, and, you know, the Uranus opposition, yeah. All that in combination makes that Neptune square Neptune. It could be, you know, great in, say, busting open, you know, any confining barriers to truth, natural law, natural truth of everything, including ourselves. But getting to that point can be kind of, you know, disconcerting during that transit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is like, I think there's a lot of people who, you know, like they work every day, they come home, they have dinner, they relax, watch some TV or whatever, you know, and it's just kind of like the realization of like, this actually is my life right now. Like, you know, I'm in my 40s and like, this is like what is this what you know, is this like, am I gonna like do more? Like, is there more? Yeah, it's interesting. That, yeah.
This is Shelley. I'm sorry, I'm probably in the dark right now, but I'm Neptune, Neptune in Sag in the 8th house, and Pluto and Libra in the 6th. and I'm a Neptune square. And all of what you're saying, what Wanda said and Bradley said, is exactly everything that I've been going through too. So that totally resonates.
Any other questions or comments? Last call.
Well, I just have it in the 5th house, Neptune. And it's not really a question. I just wonder a lot. I feel like definitely related to relationship and creativity, like imposter syndrome with Neptune in the 5th house.
Well, Della, maybe that means that even though you're thinking that you're an imposter, you're really not. You're the real deal.
Yeah, thank you. I'm working on it.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I guess we will wind this down. Fabulous meeting. Thank you so much, Bradley. And would you all please thank Bradley Naragon?
Thanks, Bradley.
Thank you,
That was
Brad.
fun.
Very interesting.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
We'll see y'all next week.
Much. Okay.
Bye.